We've been studying through the book of Isaiah, and every chapter to me has been incredible. There is something major in every single chapter, and tonight's no exception. We're going to see some more remarkable things that the Lord is going to predict through the prophet Isaiah. So I want to review on the map. We've got the map, and I just want to take a minute and review a little bit. What was the first woe? Anybody remember? What was the first woe? Chapter 13. I know it was a couple of weeks ago. That's a long time for some of us. Babylon. Who was the second woe? What was the next woe pronounced? Assyria. Assyria. Up there on your map. You might want to mark them on your map too. Who is next after that? Philistia. The Philistines, the coastal area, which is, well, we hear about Ashkelon and Ashdod being bombed. Those are Israeli cities today, but Gaza was a Philistine city too, back in David's time. So Philistia, and of course Moab. And tonight we're going to get into Syria, whose capital is Damascus. And there they are. And we're going to finish up with a brief treatise on Ethiopia. And that chapter is incredibly fascinating, and I'll tell you why when we get there. But we come to chapter 17, and this is the fifth burden. The prophet has turned his attention towards Damascus, which was the capital of Syria at that time. And amazingly enough, it's the capital of Syria today. Isaiah talks about the fact that it's going to be destroyed, and it was by the Assyrians. But the city remained empty for a while, but it became another city. We don't know if it's exactly on the same spot, or, you know, usually like in Israel, we talk about tells, where you use the building materials from a past city to build on top, A lot of other places, they just said, now let's move next door. We'll borrow whatever we need to build over here. And that's what a lot of people believe actually happened in Damascus. But he's starting with Damascus here. It's addressed to Damascus, but it's going to focus on Israel by the time we get to verse 4, because he's going to mention Ephraim. You remember Ephraim was one of the names that was used for the 10 northern tribes. It's called Israel, it's called Ephraim, and tonight we're also going to be seeing that it's called Jacob's people, Jacob's tribes. They're all references to the 10 northern tribes, and the reason that Ephraim ends up being lumped in with Damascus and Syria is because they had a confederation. You may remember back a few weeks ago, they had joined together to try and overcome Judah, to force Judah to join them in a confederation against Assyria. Everybody's afraid of Assyria. Everybody's trying to make leagues and deals and partners to be able to stand against this massive army that's coming. So they hoped that a confederation would be able to stem the tide of the Assyrian advance, and Isaiah prophesies against Damascus, and as he's doing that, he's weaving in the prophecies of Ephraim because they were confederate, and he's saying, you know what, you're both going to fall through this Assyrian invasion. And these oracles, these heavy prophecies, these burdens, as he calls them, are not chronological, but the events are the same. It's the same issue. The issue is, will you trust in God? Why did all these burdens get given to Judah? Because God is saying, look, they think they're strong. They're not. They need to trust in me. This nation thinks it's strong, especially with the help of this nation. They're not. They need to trust in me. And this other nation thinks that they can overcome the Assyrians. Well, they're not. They need to trust in me. And the Assyrians think they're strong and that I'm nobody. Well, they're not. They need to learn to trust in me. And all the time the focus is, Judah, are you learning? Are you paying attention? Are you seeing what's going on? You need to learn to trust in me. And I think it's a life lesson for each and every one of us too, in that, you know, we want to trust a lot of things in this world. We know that we can trust the Lord, and it's kind of a cliche sometimes. Oh, trust the Lord. I do, but my flesh has trouble sometimes. I want to see if I can figure out, if I can help. And the Lord keeps saying, as long as you want to help, at least he tells me, as long as you want to help, I'll let you, but nothing's going to happen that you want to happen. Trust in me. Trust the Lord. So, don't trust in man. Verse 1, the burden against Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city. This was at one time one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. I already mentioned it was the capital of Syria, and the Assyrians are going to come in and devastate Damascus. God used the Assyrian leader Tiglath-Pileser, and he destroyed Damascus in 732 BC. And Damascus laid in ruins for several years. Then it became a small city in the Assyrian province of Hamath. Samaria fell 10 years later, exactly as Isaiah said. Damascus has been destroyed and rebuilt. There are several ruins in the area. And again, we don't know which may be old Damascus and which is the newest part. It's northeast of Israel. And the northern tribes around the Sea of Galilee had a lot of interaction with the people of Damascus, the people of Syria. You'll see the church goes up there. Paul goes up there. Different people. It's still the capital of Syria today, and it seems that during the Great Tribulation, it will cease even being a city and be completely destroyed. It goes on in verse 2, and he said, the cities of Aurora are forsaken. They will be for flocks which lie down, and no one will make them afraid. This particular city was a suburb of Damascus. It's going to be destroyed. And this has taken place. And where cities once stood, there would be herdsmen with their flock. It's an interesting picture because part of it's the hustle and bustle of a city, right? There's merchants, there's travelers, there's people coming and going, getting supplies and leaving. All the activities ceased. It's just sheep. They're just out there grazing. There's some stones there. There's some places that used to be, but the sheep are just grazing quietly there. It's desolate. So they're going to be grazing where there were once cities. The fortress will also cease from Ephraim. Again, we're bringing the 10 northern tribes in here. They had a fortress. They were fortified. They knew they couldn't stand alone. The kingdom from Damascus and the remnant of Syria, they were fortified too. They will be as the glory of the children of Israel, says the Lord of hosts. Okay? Israel, again, Ephraim is the dominant tribe in Israel. And they're going to face some of the judgment of Syria because of this confederacy. And we're told in 2 Kings that both these areas were attacked by Tiglath-Pileser. And the Assyrians finally deported them. They moved them out of their cities. A lot of people would say Damascus was destroyed because the residents of Damascus no longer lived there. Part of the Assyrian policy was, we'll repatriate you to some other land that we've taken for two reasons. One, if you go back home, somebody else lives there now. And two, if somebody else wants to come back to where you are, you live there now. And it was an easy way to control the population. We can break down large populations into smaller groups and hopefully get them to assimilate into whatever area that we've taken them to. But Syria's glory was going to be lost, just as lost as Israel's glory was. They would lose sovereignty and they would become grazing lands instead of population centers. Nevertheless, the Almighty God would promise that there would be a few people left in Assyria, and there would be a few people left in Ephraim. This was the early fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, and I think you can already see the future coming with what we've covered the last few weeks. Verse 4, in that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob will wane. There's the 10 northern tribes being called Jacob now. They've been called Ephraim. They've been called Israel. Now they're being called Jacob. Do you remember the difference between Jacob and Israel? Jacob was the heel catcher. Jacob was the supplanter. Jacob was the conniver. But when Jacob wrestled with God, God gave him a new name, Israel, governed by God. Whenever you read through the scriptures and you're reading about Israel, you're reading about God's compassion on this one that was rebellious. And I like that because that's me, and that's probably all of you too. When you read Jacob, it's because they're messing up again. They're out of order. They've gone back to follow the flesh and do the things of the flesh. So the glory of Jacob will wane. It's going to decrease. It's going to go down. And the fatness of his flesh, the prosperity they had through their flocks and through their produce is going to disappear. It's going to go, that always happens in wartime. So it's going to disappear. And when Syria, I want to bring you up to date. This is something in our lifetime, and I felt this was important. When Syria, as part of the far prophecy, inhabited the Golan Heights, it was a strategically crucial high plateau above the region of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. The Syrians had many gun emplacements up there. The Syrians would bombard Israeli kibbutz and Sea of Galilee. Not as heavily as what's going on now, but they had this optimal vantage point, and Israel knew that it was always trouble. They planted trees along all the highways so tractors and trucks could travel along the road, and the gunners up on the top of the Golan Heights couldn't just pick them off. Israel knew they had to do something about it, and God did something miraculous. You ever want to read a fun story? It's called Our Man in Damascus, Eli Cohen. Eli was a spy, but he could speak the Syrian language. He had family from that area, and they set him up as a merchant. He put on parties for ranking military officials and the Syrian government, and he began to find favor with them, and they took him to the Golan Heights, and they showed him all the gun emplacements. He had a photographic memory. He memorized where every gun emplacement was. He memorized the name of the commander of each gun emplacement, and went back to Israel and told him exactly where everything was. But he went to the leader of Syria and he said, you know what? I feel bad for our soldiers out here fighting in the heat. We need to plant some trees out here. Eucalyptus grows pretty quickly. Let's plant eucalyptus trees over each gun emplacement so our boys can have some shade. And then he wires back to Israel, hit the eucalyptus trees. That's where they're all at. And it was very effective too. Syria eventually made a full-on invasion of Israel from the Golan. Israel miraculously beat them back. You wouldn't believe how miraculous it was. One guy in one tank kept jumping from dead tank to dead tank to dead tank and calling on the radio so that the Syrians would think there were multiple tanks heading their way. He didn't even have a good tank. But he kept saying that he was a brigade, and even the Israelis were confused. We don't have anything up there. What's going on? Fantastic stories that come from that period of time, miraculous stories. Israel miraculously beat them back, captured the Golan Heights. God has gotten some glory for it. He deserves a lot more glory for what went on up there. And since then, Syria has insisted that this strategic, crucial region belongs to them and they want it back. Israel also since then has adamantly said, you will never get it back. You may have read in the papers about this conflict of the Golan Heights. All you have to do is go there once and understand why Israel will never give it back. It's like saying to a burglar or a murderer, okay, you can have my back fence again and look in my windows and take pot shots at me. Or can I get you off this fence and keep you away from my house? I'm never going to let you back near it again. And that's what's going on. It's necessary for Israel's security. In the meantime, Syria has often fought Israel through terrorism and their support of terrorist groups in Lebanon. And they keep talking about the dream of greater Syria. That Syria would expand its borders, that it would be a huge country, and that it would take over all of Lebanon and northern Israel, and it would be part of their own land. It's a very powerful influence in Syrian leadership. Verse 5, it'll be as when the harvester gathers the grain and reaps the head with his arms. It shall be as he who gathers heads of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Rephaim's a valley down near Jerusalem. But he's saying the Assyrians are going to come in and they're going to harvest. What are they harvesting? They're harvesting Israelis, those in the northern kingdom. Verse 6, yet yielding grapes, gleaning grapes will be left in it. You remember gleaning was what was left over after the harvest time. What was left over the poor people could have. It was a part of the law. Poor people didn't just go to a welfare office to get a box of food. They could go out to the fields. The corners were left. Some of the gleanings and the grapes were left so that poor people could go out and get a meal. You remember in the book of Ruth, Ruth went out to glean and she ended up in Boaz's field. And Boaz was telling his workers, leave a little extra for her. And she got home and her mother-in-law goes, where were you gleaning? She knew that she brought home more than what was normal. But that's what's going to happen here. This is what it would be like. The gleaning grapes will be left, like the shaking of an olive tree. 2 or 3 olives at the top of the uttermost bough. That's how you collect your olives. They put sheets all around the olive tree and shake it and beat it with sticks. And he said, after you're all done, maybe there's 3 or 4 olives at the top left. That's all you're going to get. That's all that'll be left. And 4 or 5 in its most fruitful branches, says the Lord God of Israel. So he's declaring the inhabitants will be destroyed. Just a few will be left. Likening this harvest time to what's going to happen to the people in the northern kingdom. Isaiah revealed the reason for this defeat. In the day of God's judgment, Jacob's prosperity would become lean, as when one grows old and he loses his former strength. I don't know anything about that. I'll have to ask some of the rest of you. Just kidding. But because of her unbelief and her lack of trust in God, she would experience a thorough reaping of her population. And as reapers harvest abundant grain and crops in the productive valleys near Jerusalem, yet a remnant would survive, like the few olives or the fruit left after the harvest. Not much left. And the Assyrians will have come through like a harvest. And, they're extremely cruel. People who have studied the Assyrians, and I would say it's an interesting study, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you don't like gruesome, gross things, because the Assyrians were extremely cruel. There were many cities that the Assyrian army would surround, and the population would commit suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Assyrian. It was going to be an easier death than to be caught by them. When they did take captives, they were tortured by the Assyrians. Here's a quote. One of the ancient monuments discovered in the ruins of ancient Assyria has the inscription of King Ashur-zerpa. He reigned in 883 BC, and he wrote this of a conquered city. Their men, young and old, I took as prisoners. Of some I cut off the feet and hands. Of others I cut off their ears, nose, and lips. Of the young men, ears I made a heap, and the old men's heads I built a minaret. I'm trying to think of what holy man is going to climb up this tower of heads to call people to prayer. It's just beyond my comprehension. There are records of Assyrian officials pulling out tongues, displaying mounds of human skulls, just to bring stark terror and horror and wealthy tribute from the surrounding nations. I'm sorry, it gets worse, and I'm not going to go to the worst, so we've gone far enough. Nowhere in the pages of history, not even today, are there any bloodier records than of the Assyrian wars. Assyrian kings put out the eyes of their enemy, and they led them captive by putting a hook through their lip and leading them away. Do you understand a little bit now why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh? Okay, it's the capital of Assyria. God says, go to Nineveh. And Jonah's like, no, I don't want to go. Why didn't he want to go? He knew that God was gracious. He knew that they might repent and God would forgive them. And he didn't want them to be forgiven. He wanted these nasty people off the earth. He didn't want to go over and share the good news with them. He went to go the other direction as far as he could, and God wouldn't let him get away. Here's the incredible thing about God. I've shared this with you before. There's something that's known among the rabbis as the cure before the curse. God is always doing something to protect and provide for his people ahead of a disastrous situation. By the time, Noah was about 100 years before the Assyrian invasion of Israel. Okay? In that 100 years, they did repent. They stopped a lot of their atrocities, and by the time they came into northern Israel, they were not practicing the mutilations that they had before. God did not allow his people Israel to be mutilated by the Assyrians like they had done in past times. God was so gracious, but this is the reason Jonah was pouting. God's response is interesting. He said, and should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right and left hand? 120,000 children. And then that's what my mind's been on this week. There's children all over Gaza, all over Israel, all over the West Bank, all over Lebanon. And they're innocent. And God is concerned for those children. So remember to pray for the children. God pledged himself to Israel. And then he declared Judah doesn't need to fear her neighbors. It's God with whom she should come to terms. Don't worry about who's around you. Don't worry about who you can confederate with. Worry about what's your relationship with the Almighty. That's the most important thing. Verse 7. In that day, a man will look to his Maker. In that day, when the trials come, when the tribulation comes, what happens to everybody in the world when something bad happens? They pray, whether they believe in God or not, whether they believe in prayer or not, they pray. And in that day, when things are really bad, a man will look to his makers, and his eyes will have respect for the Holy One of Israel. They're beginning to learn their lesson. So this coming destruction would result in those remaining Israelis and Syrians, and I'm saying past prophecy and future prophecy, the remaining Israelis, and there's going to be some devastation during the tribulation period. Remember, 2/3 of Israel is going to be wiped out. But those remaining Israelis and Syrians are going to respond by turning to God. And in the midst of such severe judgment, some would respond as they should, with humble respect for God. It's going to happen. It happened then, it's going to happen again. Israel will be awakened. Verse 8, he will not look to the altars, the work of his hands. He will not respect what his fingers have made. Right now, that's weapons. Nor the wooden images, nor the incense altars. They're not going to look to false idols. That were the reason that God brought judgment against them. Because you forgot your God, because you're looking to other things besides me. They'll return to the Holy One. One of the reasons for great tribulation that's coming to the world, and tribulation that's in the world now, is the same as trials and tribulations we go through today as believers. Why am I going through this trial, Lord? Why am I going through this situation? Why didn't you just make life easy and fun for me? Why do I have to face these things? I think one of God's purposes in judgment is to turn our focus away from idols and other things that we would trust rather than him. To get our eyes off of our images. I like that particular word he's talking about, of course, little idols, but images, I think today of screens and our images on Facebook, and how does my image look, and how many followers do I have, and how many hits have I gotten? And some people are just obsessive with this kind of thing. My Instagram page, look to the Lord. I don't care if you've got a Facebook page or an Instagram page, but is the Lord first? It's like anything else. Is God first? We don't want to worship money. We don't want to worship cars. We don't want to worship relationships. We want to worship God first. Then we can have money and cars and relationships. But let's keep what's first. Let's keep the right thing in the right place. James tells us, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect, or whole, that can be translated, and complete, lacking nothing. We also know in Matthew, seek first the kingdom of God, everything else you need will be added unto you, but seek God first. Going to take that kind of tribulation at that time in the future for people to get rid of their images, their idols, their self-reliance. That's been a problem with Israel. That's why they had such much trouble in the Yom Kippur War. We're good, we're perfect, we got it together. Happened again this time. How did they get caught off guard? Self-reliance, pride. God our Father sometimes puts us in fixes to fix us. Think about that. He puts us in fixes to fix us. So we don't try to fix our own situations and our own energy. These people in Isaiah's day and the end times and in our lives, trials come that we might look to the Lord and ask the Lord, what are you trying to say to me, Lord? I got to spend some time with you. That's what David would always do. What's up, Lord? What do you want to change in me? I don't want the Lord to change the situation as much as I want him to change me so that I can be where he wants me to be and do what he wants me to do. So They'll look up to the Lord in that day. Verse 9, and in that day his strong cities will be as a forsaken bough, and the uppermost branch, which they left because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. What he's saying is when Israel came into the land, a lot of people abandoned their cities. Now when the Assyrians come into the land, people are going to abandon their cities. What was one of our prayer requests tonight? Israelis abandoning their cities. They have to clear out. They have to get out of there because of the danger that's coming. And no pagan altars, no wooden images, no incense altars, and no fortified cities would keep you completely safe. Their only hope was in the Lord. So why will there be tribulation? Look at verse 10. Because you have forgotten the God of your salvation. Here's the bottom line. You have not been mindful of the rock of your stronghold. I've mentioned before, just do a word study on the word rock. You'll find out it is Jesus Christ, and that's who he's referencing here too. You have not been mindful of the rock of your stronghold. Therefore, and to Jews too, it's the chief cornerstone. It's the rock. So therefore, you will plant pleasant plants and set out foreign seedlings. He's talking to the northern kingdom. Some see this planting little seeds as faith in idols. But he's saying your agricultural attempts will be frustrating. And their attempt to find satisfaction by pursuing other gods. Don't forget the God of your salvation. Well, how do we remember God? Jesus made it real plain. He said, look, here's what I want you to do. Remember the cup and the bread? I want you to do this in remembrance of me. I want you to remember me. I want you to do it often. I want you to think about what this means. It's not just some grape juice and a cracker. It's my body which was broken. It was my blood that was shed. Please do this often and remember the price I paid for you. What I gave for you. What you mean to me. Do this often in remembrance of me. Verse 11, in that day you'll make your plant to grow, and in the morning you'll make the seed to flourish, but the harvest will be a heap of ruins in the day of grief and desperate sorrow. In the tribulation that's coming, in the times that are coming, God's judgment will bring man's work to nothing because they had forgotten God and turned away from him and were worshiping these other idols. That's the reason God allowed judgment, using Assyria as a tool in this judgment to destroy Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. Fun fact, today Israel has planted, since 1948, more than 3 million trees. They've completely reforested the land. They've become leaders in agriculture. They are known as the breadbasket of the Middle East. They provide fruit and produce for Europe, Africa, and Asia. They produce more than any single country in those particular continents, the European continent, the African continent, or the Asian continent, can produce. Israel sells their produce all over the world under different labels. It doesn't say product of Israel. A lot of them say product of Jordan. Whatever it takes, they're feeding people. But for the most part, they have forgotten their God. You go to Israel today, the majority of Jews are secular Jews. Yeah, we'll keep Passover. It's a good time to go get the relatives, have some dinner, But they're not serious about it. There are, by the latest facts I could find, there are 12.6 Orthodox population in the entire nation of Israel. 12.6 are Orthodox. 12.6 are those that are concerned about God, even though they may not even really know him personally. So, for the most part, they've forgotten their God, and there will be devastation. And though Assyria was God's tool, God now turns his word against Assyria. Verse 12, woe to the multitude of many people who make a noise like the roar of the seas and the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. This is the noise of the armies coming in like the roar of the sea. God's going to use other nations to bring judgment against Syria and Israel, and they will come against them like a flash flood that can't be stopped. That was the Assyrian army. He says in verse 13, the nations will rush like the rushing of many waters, but God will rebuke them and they will flee away and be chased like the chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. So when God brings the rush of nations against Israel, it doesn't mean that the nations he uses are walking right with him. They're not being used because they're righteous. They're being used because God can use any tool he wants to minister to his people. And when he's through, he will rebuke them and they will flee away. We've talked about this several times. Do you remember when the Assyrian armies finally came to Jerusalem? Isaiah is counsel to King Hezekiah. Hezekiah is doing everything he can to fortify the city, digging a tunnel that we get to walk through today, thousands of years later. He's trying to prepare for this invasion, and Isaiah is there to say, don't worry, God's going to protect you. It's okay. God's going to take care of you. And in verse 14 we read, then behold at eventide trouble, and before the morning he's no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who rob us. So many warriors would descend on Israel like the waves of the sea, and they would quickly dissipate because the Lord would rebuke them. They'd disappear like dust before a strong wind. The terror would be so strong that they would vanish overnight. God would wipe them out. They're here in the evening, in the morning they'll be gone. This did come against the northern kingdom. They did conquer the northern kingdom. They did conquer Moab. This is the Assyrians. They did conquer Ashdod, Philistia. They did conquer Egypt and Ethiopia, and they did not conquer Judah. Matter of fact, you remember the threats when the Jews are sitting on the wall and the Assyrian army is out there, and the commander is saying, where are the gods of Syria? Where are the gods of Samaria? Where are the gods of Egypt? These were all nations that had been defeated. We wiped them out. Don't think you can trust in your God. Don't let Hezekiah lead you into false trust, saying our God will deliver you. What God is able to deliver from the hand of the Assyrians? And they were blaspheming God, and God took care of it. You remember? He sent one angel, and the next morning, they were all dead. There was no threat. There was no Assyrian army to threaten them. They looked over the wall, and all they saw was corpses. So in the evening, verse 14, sudden terror. Before the morning, they're gone. This is the portion of those who loot us and those who plunder us. And I think it's a comforting principle that even in the midst of judgment, God shows mercy. That's what he wants to do. As bad as it was going to be for Israel, it could have been worse. Instead, God would allow it for a time, then he would rebuke those attacking Israel. And we find that Israel was not at the mercy of circumstances of their enemies. Israel was at the mercy of God. And so are we. We're not at the mercy of circumstances. We're at the mercy of God. We'll get into that in future fulfillment later, chapter 37. I know everybody's chomping at the bit for that because we want to get out of here. But we'll see that there were so many dead bodies that the birds and the beasts of the air would feed on them. There's an interesting spot in northern Israel. I just had to bring this up because I just saw it this last year. I know it was there, but I had to go see it. It's called the Hula Valley. Of course, the Hula Valley was a big swamp area, and when Israel came in and they started draining the rivers and clearing the land, they decided to leave a part of this swamp area, Lake Hula, because it was a sanctuary for birds. Birds fly south for the winter down to Africa, and they cross over and they stop in Israel. Then in summer, they fly back up through Israel and end up back in Europe. And there are millions of them, millions of birds. And Ezekiel 39 talks about these birds having a great feast. At the end of the Battle of Armageddon, they're going to be able to feed on flesh. We'll see it when we get to Ezekiel 39. And we're also going to see it again when we get to the book of Revelation, chapter 19. Because the same thing is said there. There's going to be a lot of birds on there. This bird sanctuary is there. God's already prepared the birds to clean up the mess. So, chapter 18 is very short. We come to the sixth burden. Many believe that this is the most difficult chapter in the Bible, and there's a lot of strange interpretations of it. Some see this as Egypt. However, Egypt's going to be covered in chapter 19 and 20. There are a few, and I'm mentioning this for fun. You're going to go, what are we doing this for? Because I'm going to tell you in advance, I don't believe this, but there are several commentaries that believe this is England and the United States here in chapter 18. There are some people that are so bent on trying to find, where's the U.S. in prophecy? Well, it's not there, but it's got to be. Look here, look at chapter 18. It's beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. We're beyond 2 oceans. We're far away from them. And they'll go in here and they'll say, we send ambassadors, and to a nation tall and smooth. And they're saying tall is, they're translating it powerful, and smooth is sophistication. We advanced technology and systems that others don't have. And we've been powerful in treading down the nation, a land who the rivers divide. Well, that's the Mississippi and all these other rivers, And it's like, no, you really got to stretch to try and make this fit. But there's a lot of people who do. So verse 2 talks about ambassadors being sent by boat. And it says a reed boat. We know that nobody in the modern age is using reed boats anymore. So they translate it a swift boat, a speedy ship. You're stretching again. It's not going to work. Prior to the invention of the airplane, the only way ambassadors could travel was by boat. I don't know any ambassadors of ours that ever went anywhere in a reed boat. That we're going to look at the clear and simple reading of the text. He says Ethiopia. And was there an Ethiopia? Yeah, there's the ancient map. Is there an Ethiopia today? Yes. Were they going to be involved in this whole thing with Assyria? Yes. Will they be involved in the situation and scenario of the last days? Yes. So let's just stick with what the text says. Let's not try to make up something else. Woe to the land shadowed with buzzing wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. God is calling to this land. Listen to me. God's calling the people, which sends ambassadors by sea, even in vessels of reed on the waters, saying, Go, swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth of skin, to the people terrible from the beginning onward, a nation powerful in treading down those whose land the river divides. Reed boats, again, don't apply to any modern nation. Ethiopia sent ambassadors to Jerusalem to make a confederacy. They wanted protection from Assyria too. If you read back in history, at this time, Ethiopia was a very strong and powerful nation. Ethiopia, at the time of Isaiah, ruled Egypt. They'd taken over the land of Egypt, and they are kind of the competitors to Assyria as far as powerful nations in the world, but they're freaked out. Assyria's on the move, and we need some allies. We need some help. If we can make friends with people like Judah and Israel and those, maybe there'll be a buffer zone for us before they get cleared out to Ethiopia. So they sent ambassadors. As the Ethiopian ambassadors, they invited Judah to rebel against the Assyrians, and they are asking Israel, please send swift messengers back to the land of the tall and smooth-skinned people. Send them back to Ethiopia to let them know that you're with us. We need you to be a witness. We need you to guarantee that safety. We need to know that we've got a non-aggression pact signed here so that they'll know that you're with us. And the Ethiopians would hope to hear that Judah had rebelled and that had aligned itself with Ethiopia and Egypt. So envoys from Cush may have traveled to Moab and Philistia as well as Judah, seeking an alliance against Assyria. And Assyria was conquering, and these Ethiopian ambassadors, these tall, smooth-skinned men, can be translated also large and polished. Again, the idea of powerful and technically advanced. We're trying to get to Judah to join with them to fight. Now in the days, again, of Ethiopia, they were a major world power and the chief rival to Assyria. And since Judah is caught in the middle of this conflict, it would make sense, you would think, for Judah to join with them to protect themselves from Assyria. But Isaiah was counseling against this confederation once again because God was going to watch over them and God was going to take care of them. Don't get involved in this mutual defense alliance with these Ethiopians. Verse 3, all inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, when he lifts up a banner in the mountains, you see it. And when he blows a trumpet, you hear it. When God's going to take care of this, you'll know. You'll see the banner. You'll hear the trumpet. Now, again, people with unusual interpretation of these things see that banner being the Ark of the Covenant. God's going to lift up the Ark of the Covenant. Let's go way back in history before this. Let's go clear back to Solomon. Remember Solomon? Solomon was this wise man. He built the temple. He had all these incredible things. And a woman came to meet him. Anybody remember where she came from? Queen of Sheba, which is Cush, which is Ethiopia. So this queen of Ethiopia shows up to meet Solomon, and she's so blown away. You know, the half wasn't even told me. This is beyond what I heard. And when she leaves, this is an involved story, but it's kind of fun if you look it up. Her son, she has a son named Manasseh, and Manasseh, of course, has stayed with Solomon till he's 18. He's going to go home. But he sees Solomon slipping, and some of the priests do too. And so the story goes that they made a fake Ark of the Covenant to put in the temple and gave Menelaus the real one because he was going to take the fake one back to Ethiopia as a reminder that those people would worship God there. There is a church in Ethiopia today that claims to have the Ark of the Covenant. Every few years they say, we're going to pull it out and show everybody, and everybody holds their breath in anticipation of the date, and then they go, we decided not to this year, maybe next year. So what about this son? What about Menelaus? It said in the Bible, Solomon gave her everything she wanted. And so the son is not in the Bible. He's a legend, but he already had 1,000 wives, 300 wives and 700 concubines. It sounds a little callous, but what's another woman to somebody like Solomon? You want a kid to take home to Ethiopia? Okay, I can do that. Here's the point. God is in control, and God has plans for the nation of Ethiopia. We don't think about that a lot, do we? There's something that's interesting to me. Look at verse 4. The Lord said to me, I will take my rest. I will look from my dwelling place like clear heat in sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the harvest. In other words, he's more than able to deal with the Assyrians by himself. He doesn't need the Ethiopians. He can do it without their help. Now, here's what's significant. We've been reading burdens, but there's no rebuke in this passage against Ethiopia. Okay? God wasn't going to judge Ethiopia for their offer of an alliance. Perhaps the idea was well-intentioned, even though it's an unnecessary offer. Instead, it's a message to Judah again, trust the Lord. Here again, the crazy guys. Okay, look at the last half of this verse. Clear heat in sunshine and a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. You wouldn't believe the lengths that some people go to try and prove that this is actually an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, of course, destroying all the electronics in America, or an atomic blast, and America's destroyed. Well, that's what happens to America, according to, if you're going to follow chapter 18 and think America's in the prophecy, it doesn't end very well. So, anyway, verse 5, for before the harvest, when the bud is perfect, and the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he will cut off the sprigs and with pruning hooks and take away and cut down the branches. God can prune Assyria all by himself. He will destroy the Assyrian army completely, that they will be left together for the mountain birds of prey. Verse 6, they will be left together for the mountain birds of prey and for the beast of the earth. The birds of prey will summer on them, and all the beasts of the earth will winter on them. So the vultures are going to eat all summer, and many will have food for the winter too, and wild animals. In that time, a present will be brought to the Lord of hosts from a people tall and smooth of skin, and from a people terrible from their beginning onward, a nation powerful and treading down, whose land the rivers divide, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, to Mount Zion. Ethiopia is going to bring a gift to Israel. Now we could say partially fulfilled in the Queen of Sheba. She brought lots of gifts, spices and all kinds of different animals and peacocks and gorillas and all kinds of stuff. But the prediction of Assyria's destruction by the hand of God, there would be no need for the Ethiopians to join. God's going to take care of Judah. And in the end time, all of this, many of these aggressive nations would bring presents to him at Mount Zion. Ethiopia is one of those nations. I can't wait. But here's another thought. Perhaps Acts chapter 8 is a partial fulfillment. There wasn't always just the pre and the post. Sometimes there was others in between. Acts chapter 8. You remember there's a man who came to visit Israel? Powerful man. An authoritative man. He was a part of the government. He was the queen's bookkeeper, right? The treasurer. Remember his name? Chapter 8. You remember Philip's got an evangelistic thing going on, and he's told by the Lord, leave this evangelistic thing. I want you to meet somebody. And he takes him down and he meets the eunuch. This eunuch from Ethiopia, from Queen Candace. Okay? And he happens to be reading the same book we're reading. And he sees Philip, and Philip goes, you understand what you're reading? And he goes, how can I unless somebody explains it to me? So Philip climbs up in the chariot. I know he read Ezekiel 37 to him. I wonder if he read Ezekiel chapter 18 to him. Hey, look, this is all about your country. It even says the name. So perhaps that man coming from Ethiopia to find something, bringing his gifts there, he bought a Torah scroll. Those are really expensive. Not everybody can have one of those, but he's got one. He's trying to read. He's an intelligent man, an intellectual man, and he goes home with the King of Kings. He receives Jesus Christ, and Philip baptizes him. So there's some other fun stuff in here like that, but chapter 19 and 20 will be the burden against Egypt, and this oracle clarifies God's purpose for Egypt, another nation and the Judeans wanted help from, and Egyptians wanted Judea to trust them during the time of the Syrian expansion, and it would involve judgment followed by a blessing. This is such a crazy prophecy. Chapter 19, please read ahead, because part of this prophecy was fulfilled in our lifetimes. Those of you that are here, part of chapter 19 was fulfilled very distinctly in our lifetime. So read ahead. You'll be blessed. Let's go ahead and stand and close with a word of prayer.